One of the questions that I get asked most often is how to design the webinar slide deck. What makes for an appealing slide deck that keeps your audience engaged? And that's why in this episode, I am so excited to have the opportunity to introduce Laura Patricelli, my personal own graphic designer, on what makes for a fantastic and awesome design for your webinar. You're listening to April Reed here of the Webinar Hustlers Entrepreneur Podcast, and this is episode 24.
Want to work less and sell more? Welcome to the Webinar Hustlers Entrepreneur Podcast, the podcast to help you scale up and take your business to the next level with webinars that sell for you. Each episode focuses on the money mindset, online marketing, and sales strategies to get you more leads and convert leads to sales, all with webinars. And now your host, business and webinar strategist, April Reed.
Hi, Laura. Welcome to the show.
Hi, April. Thank you so much for having me on this afternoon. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. As I was mentioning, I really wanted to have a graphic designer on the show because webinars, when you do your slide decks, when you do your presentation, you really want to engage the audience and have them in there with the webinar with you. And how better to do that than with visuals? And it was like, okay, so if I have a graphic designer on this show with webinars being so visual, how is that going to work? And I was talking to Laura and she was like, oh yeah, you could do it this way. We could do it that way. So I'm like, oh, I'm great. I'm glad that you have ideas.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm glad you're here. And I can't wait to learn from you and improve my own webinars with everything you're going to share with us today.
For sure. I mean, with webinars, you have access to only two senses. You have the audio and the visual. So you really want to be able to stimulate your audience brains through whatever you possibly can. And it just helps you stand out in the sea of webinars.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's really important, but for those who may or may not be that creative, how important is really important? Like, how important is good designs for your slide deck, your webinar slides?
Well, it's important for a few reasons. I'll review the why before we kind of dig in. But as I mentioned before, you really just want to keep your audience engaged and interested in what you're saying in any way possible so that they're more likely to remember you, they're more likely to remember what you're teaching, and eventually just rely on you as the go-to expert. And if you stimulate their senses through the quality of the content you're sharing, as well as visually through the slide deck itself, then you're more likely to make an impact on your audience. And this is especially important for anyone with a primarily female demographic or audience, because women are visual learners. And when you accompany quality audio content with a nice looking slide deck, then they're more likely to get value from what you're offering. You also really just, in every piece of marketing you put forward, you want to be seen as a true professional, somebody that your audience can look up to, that they can inspire to. And unfortunately, you really can't be seen as a professional if you have a half-assed slide deck. No matter how awesome the content is that you're talking about, it's going to affect the way that they remember you. And of course, this doesn't mean that you need to have a super complicated slide deck with lots of graphics everywhere. Really, it just means that it has to look clean and easy to read. But I go over that more later.
I totally agree with that. I've been on presentations where I couldn't concentrate and I had to hop off just because it was like, what am I looking at? It's cluttered. It's hurting my brain. And it was really sad that I couldn't pay attention enough to really listen to what was being discussed because it was probably really good content and information. But like you said, women are visual and it was just something wasn't jiving with me.
For sure. And on top of that, it's about finding the happy medium between too much content and not enough when it comes to webinars. Because if you have every single word that you're speaking listed out in the slide deck, then people are just going to hop off the webinar and download the slide deck because all that information is there. You really want to save some of that value for the conversation itself and for you being the one in front of them talking, because that just goes right into what I was saying about them perceiving you as the expert. And when you're using the slide deck to create visual interest and just outline the content that you're talking about, then it pretty much guarantees that you're going to keep them on the call. Whereas otherwise they would just be like, oh, I can get this information later.
Wow, you are the first person that has ever brought that up, because usually you hear that you don't want to put everything on the slides because as you're talking about the slide, they're already reading, you've lost their attention.
Yep, one at a time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is the first time I've heard, like, well, if you have everything on the slide, they can just download the slide and be on their way. Such a great point that you do want to show yourself as the expert. And the only way to get this information is to show up live on the webinar, because you're teaching it and you can't get it off of this slide that has maybe a picture of a elephant or something to prove your point. So I love that. Yeah, good point. Definitely.
Oh, for sure. And really, ultimately, your slide deck just gives you, the presenter, another opportunity to convey your entire brand experience. So you want to have a recognizable brand, something that your audience can come back to and recognize. And that means staying consistent with whatever signature style you've been using throughout your entire marketing ethos, not just the webinar. I mean, the deck is just one piece of the brand experience, but it really needs to look like it's in the same family as your website and any associated landing or sales pages. When you're consistent, it makes it easy for your audience, especially a female audience, to bookmark you, the expert, in their memory. Even if they recognize your name, it's very easy for an audience to kind of lose track of who you are and where they sit in your go-to expert field.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you can convey that brand experience visually and have that recognizable look and feel, the more likely your audience is going to be to remember you. And one thing that I always recommend, and something I recommend to your audience as well, is when you're creating any sort of webinar slide deck or even a promotional material to promote your webinar on Facebook, you just want to have a very short, very brief signature style motto that you can keep in mind and that will allow you to create everything with a similar feel. So, for instance, if you want a dark, gold trimmed, very royal brand aesthetic, then the phrase royal and premium would be something that you want to keep in mind when you're creating a new slide deck. That way it stays consistent. So when you're in Google Slides or Keynote or PowerPoint, you just have to ask yourself consistently, is this royal and premium? Does this look royal and premium? And so even if you're using different colors or you have different images that you're using, that same look and feel can kind of seep through into everything you make. And this would be actually a good time. I have an entire quiz that I created specifically to help you determine a signature style that is in line with your personality.
Oh, yes. I took that quiz.
Oh, you did? Awesome.
I did, yes. And I loved it. And I definitely thought it was on the money with my signature style. So can you tell us a little bit about the quiz you created?
Sure. So it uses personality preferences, and also I have a few color palettes that are in there, so you can kind of pick and choose and use the quiz to brainstorm on how you can let your personality shine through. And at the end of the quiz, I have this little freebie download that first of all, you can see what your signature style is, whether it's clean and professional, or elegant and feminine, or even visual and vintage. And you can download this little cheat sheet that gives you a bunch of fonts, colors, themes, and brands that fall in with that signature style that you can use as inspiration moving forward. And I'm actually in the process of creating an entire product that goes deep into each of those signature styles and acts as inspiration guides for entrepreneurs who are still in the branding stage and looking to figure out what style represents them, which is hard when you're doing it yourself. I mean, if you have a designer on board, then you can just sort of outsource that. But when you're doing it yourself, finding your signature style can be really challenging. So I'm sure you're going to have this link in the podcast footnotes, but it's designmastermind.nyc/quiz. Super easy.
Yes, definitely. Just to the audience, you definitely want to take this quiz. It's fun, it's short, and it's on the money. I was clean and professional, and it's kind of like how I live my whole life, like even my car and my home. So it was like, wow.
And now when you go into Canva and you're creating promotional materials for your new podcast or a new freebie, you can just have clean and professional in your head while you're making it, so you can be kind of course correcting as you're doing your DIY designs.
Love that. Okay, great. So maybe we can move on to the how. Is there any easy way for my listeners to remember all this when they're building their next webinar slide deck?
Such a great question, April. So whenever I'm doing talks or running my own webinars, I always talk about the 3 C's of promotional design. And this is actually a Seth Godin marketing concept that I've repurposed for the world of design. And I'm going to use it today to apply to webinar slides specifically. But you can also use these 3 C's to keep in mind while you're building any sort of sales page, or you're launching a new product, or you're just doing a Facebook promotion. But what you need to remember when you're working on any sort of visual promotional material is that your stuff needs to be creative, compelling, and consistent.
Love that. Love that.
That's really important.
Yeah. And so I love design. I actually went to school for design a little bit.
Oh, amazing.
It's nothing I do on a regular. But even I sometimes struggle with finding my creative mode, because it may be something I love to do, but it's not my zone of genius. So how can somebody, maybe they feel like they don't have a creative bone in their body, how can they feel creative in order to create their slide deck, or really just creative in general?
Keeping your audience's attention by being creative is definitely something that you always would attribute to a designer or someone who does design for a living. But there's a few things that you can keep in mind, that looking creative isn't really what we're going for here. You're really just looking to stand out. And when I say creative, what I really mean is unique, something that can stand out as quintessentially you. And a lot of this has to do with creating a consistent brand design, which we'll talk about later. But ways that you can look creative and stand out in your webinar slides is to first and foremost use inspiring images. A lot of times that means just including people. And I'm sure most of your audience knows that when you include faces and people in Facebook ads, the click rate goes way up. And the same goes for any sort of webinar deck as well. If you include people in your slides or any sort of relevant "this could be you" imagery, then it acts as a bookmark. It lets people put themselves in that position, and it kind of triggers this whole, oh, I do need that product, or I do need this information reflex. And again, we'll talk about photos a little bit later, but choosing really awesome fonts and colors to use in your webinar deck is also important, and a very easy way to get your creative juices flowing, even if you don't have any. Because fonts and colors are just real fun to browse through. I've been browsing fonts and collecting fonts since I was maybe 8 years old and got my first computer. I mean, you would have looked at all the clip art and Microsoft Word art that I was playing with as a middle schooler and said, oh yeah, this girl's going to be a graphic designer for sure. Even though I didn't even realize that that was a career option. So thank goodness I'm on the right track. But in case you're not super into fonts and colors already, there's a few good resources that I can recommend. Coolors.co, which is COOLORS.co, is an absolutely incredible color palette generator. It's really fun to play around with. And I've come up with some beautiful color combinations for my clients using that resource. So
Yeah, I used that too when we were working together. I love it. And we're going to link that website in the show notes as well.
oh, fantastic. Fantastic. And for fonts, I always, because I'm a designer and I oftentimes use premium fonts on multiple projects, I purchase my script fonts or my title fonts from Creative Market. And that's a really good place to find that sort of pop font that you can use for a logo or a title. And for anything else, Google Web Fonts is a fantastic resource. They even have a font pairing mechanism that's in their interface. So if you start browsing Google Web Fonts and you click on a font you like, let's say it's Railway, which is what April uses for her brand, you can click on Railway and it shows other fonts that are popular to use with Railway. So
Oh, that's neat.
oh, it's so neat. And I use that resource all the time when I'm mixing and matching fonts for my clients' websites. And it's just a good way to get that extra sort of creative design expertise without having to hire a designer.
Yeah. So let's say somebody already has a font that they like. Would they be able to go to the Google Web Fonts and it's there? Like, how robust is this website? Like all the fonts out there?
Well, so Google Web Fonts is a public domain directory. So all of the web fonts that are hosted on that website are available for use by anyone anywhere in the world for personal projects, for web projects, whatever. If you have a font that you really like, you can do a quick search using their search bar to see if it's featured in Google Web Fonts. It might be. If it's not, then you might want to check to see where else it's hosted. And this isn't really necessary though for webinar slides because you can use any font that's on your computer for webinar slides. So if you do have a font that you really like, you can just use it. Unless of course you're using Google Slides, in which case you would have to choose one of the fonts that they have available. But if you're using Keynote or PowerPoint, then yeah, have at it. Have fun with it. I mean, again, you have to have it be clean and professional and legible,
Right.
which we'll get to in a minute. But it's just a good resource if you're still in the process of choosing fonts. But otherwise, if you have a font you like, then by all means, use it.
Yeah, I definitely love Railway. And now, kind of something I mentioned before when we were talking about the designs of these presentations I've been on that kind of just were snooze because I couldn't really get into the designs of them, is having too much text.
Mm-hmm.
And I know when I created my first presentation, it wasn't really for a webinar. It was like back in the day, like when you're at corporate and you have to do a presentation, it's just the death of bullet points and then text after text after text, which isn't okay. But
I mean, it's okay if it's organized. If it's bullet points, if they're relevant, then I get what you mean. It can be a little overwhelming sometimes to have a webinar slide deck that distracts, as we were talking about before. And that's where the second C comes into play, which is compelling. And the easier your slides are to skim through, the more compelling they're going to be to your audience. So if you make sure that there's only 3 to 4 bullet points on a slide, or some slides just have a headline and then you talk about the headline, then that's what you need to keep in mind. As I mentioned previously, it's really not cool to just read off your slide deck. It's much more important to use the slide deck as an opportunity to paraphrase what you're talking about and allow people who were drifting to catch up and kind of get back into what you're talking about so that they can kind of jump back in halfway through a sentence and know what you're talking about. And ways to do this are, as I mentioned before, have 3 to 5 bullet points on a slide. Don't use paragraph text because it's just going to look like a block of text, and you want to break that paragraph up into bullet points. So having 3 to 5 bullet points on a slide is a good way to have that information organized. And if you're talking about one very important concept, then you'll just want to have one attention grabbing headline on the slide, and that's it. You can save the description and any extra details for your slide notes and for the talk itself. The headline copy is extremely important because this is going to be what grabs people's attention and keeps them engaged with what you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. And I mean, there's other tips that I could give that you can keep in mind. And if any of you out there are taking notes, then the next 3 bulleted point lists are going to be very important for you. I always recommend having a white background. And then if you want to have any sort of decorations, then have it be at the top and bottom, or maybe a box that surrounds your content. You really don't want to have white text on top of a dark background because it just makes it harder for people to skim through. And they're already placing most of their focus on listening to you speak. So if you have very clean dark text on a white background, that'll make it much easier for you to keep them engaged.
Yeah, good point. Because a lot of times I'm sometimes watching a webinar on my phone and that tiny screen. So that's definitely a good point.
Exactly. And that also reminds me. So the second thing, in addition to having that clean white background, the second thing is don't go too crazy with lettering effects. So you can increase the letter spacing a little bit maybe, but you really don't have to pay much attention to that. But you do want to increase the line height for your bullet points to like 1.3 to 1.5 times the font size. And that's really important because if you have bullet points or any sort of text that's really cramped looking, the people who are following along and skimming while they listen to you are not even going to pay it a second glance. They're going to not look at any of it and they're just going to keep going. It just decreases the overall value of your presentation because when text is too cramped, it's a visual nightmare. It makes you want to hop off the call just because it's like such a turn off. And the same goes for, and this is the third tip, spacing out your content and making sure that your slides, all of the text is in the middle. You don't want it to be too close to the edge because it doesn't really give your eye room to skim the page. And especially for any of your listeners who are on their phones, it's not going to be super legible to them. It's just not going to be something that they want to read because all of that text butts up right up against the side. And this also goes for any sort of promotional content, whether it's a Facebook post or a freebie resource. You really want to move your content away from the edges. Text and edges do not mesh unless, of course, you're a professional designer who's really using that with purpose.
That's the first thing I notice when I'm looking at anyone's design or their content. I haven't noticed it so much on webinars. And I know we're talking about webinars, but just design in general, because you're going to use designs in other places than just webinars, is when the text is too close to the edge. And I don't know if it's because of my design background or if it's just really that obvious, it's like, ouch, it irks the eyes. So it's good to know, to have that number figure or to ballpark how far away from the edge it should be. And I was just shocked how many people just don't really notice that, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's the mark of an amateur designer, and you don't want that. You want to look as professional as possible.
Right.
And your stuff is really going to look just so amateur if your content is butting up against the edges of pretty much anything. And that goes for photos too. You're going to want to space out your photos from the rest of the content by at least 20 pixels. If you have text that goes right up against the photo, again, the mark of an amateur designer.
Right.
So do not want.
Fantastic. And this sounds like a good place to stop. All right. So I am going to conclude this episode right here. There's much more that we talked about, maybe another 20 minutes or so, but I'm going to save that till next week so I can respect everyone who is used to this podcast episode being between 20 and 25 minutes. And I think I'm dancing around half an hour. And so, yes, this show ran a little bit longer. So you're getting part 1. And then next week of the Webinar Hustlers Entrepreneur Podcast episode 25, you're going to get the conclusion of this show. This show was really good. So be tuned next week to get the conclusion of this episode on how you can make your webinar branding design. Particularly, we're talking about the slide deck. Value really, really good with better visuals. Awesome. Okay, so as always, you can see the highlights of this show and any links mentioned in the episode by going to www.aprilreed.com/24. Talk to you next week. I love you. Bye.